Wait, imagine you're standing in a crowded airport. Flights are boarding. Families are saying goodbye, and everything seems normal until suddenly 3 police officers rush toward a tattooed man in the security line. Within seconds, the officers surround him. People start whispering. Phones come out. Someone even says, "That tattoo looks dangerous. Maybe he's part of a gang." The man has a strange tattoo covering the side of his neck. Dark symbols, lines, and numbers that look like some kind of secret code. To everyone watching, it looks suspicious, even threatening. The police don't waste time. "Sir, step out of the line," one officer orders. The entire terminal goes silent as the man is escorted away by police. Travelers stare. Some people start recording the arrest, convinced they're witnessing something shocking. But here's the strange part. The tattooed man doesn't panic. He doesn't argue. He doesn't even look scared. Instead, he calmly tells the officers something that completely confuses them. He says, "Before you question me, you might want to call federal security." The officers look at each other, now even more suspicious. Why would a random passenger ask for federal agents? Who is this man? And what does that mysterious tattoo actually mean? But when the police finally analyze the strange symbols and numbers on his neck, everything changes. Because that tattoo isn't a gang symbol. It isn't a criminal code. In fact, when officers discover the real meaning behind those coordinates, the entire room falls silent. The man they thought was dangerous turns out to be connected to some of the most devastating disasters in the world. Earthquakes, collapsed buildings, flood rescue missions. And what those coordinates reveal about this quiet, tattooed traveler will leave the officers, and everyone watching, completely speechless. By the end of this story, the same police officers who arrested him will do something no one expected, something that will make the entire airport stop and watch. So the question is, who is this mysterious man? Why are the locations of deadly disasters tattooed across his neck? And how did a man who looked like a criminal turn out to have a story that could change the way people judge others forever? Stay with me, because what the police discover next will shock you. "Sir, step out of line now." The voice of the airport police officer cut through the busy noise of the terminal like a sharp knife. Conversation stopped. Rolling suitcases slowed. Curious eyes turned toward the scene unfolding near the security checkpoint. It was a typical afternoon at the international airport. The large terminal was packed with travelers heading to different parts of the world. Digital screens flashed flight information. Loudspeakers announced departures and last calls. Families hugged goodbye while business travelers checked their phones impatiently. But at security line number 3, everything suddenly became tense. 3 uniformed airport police officers had surrounded a tall man wearing a dark jacket and carrying a small travel bag. At first glance, he didn't look unusual. He stood calmly, his posture relaxed, as if he had nothing to worry about. But then people noticed the tattoo. It covered the side of his neck, stretching slightly up toward his jawline. It wasn't colorful or artistic, like most tattoos people were used to seeing. Instead, it looked dark and mysterious. Strange symbols, thin lines, numbers, and shapes that looked almost like a secret code. A woman standing nearby whispered to her husband, "Did you see that tattoo?" Her husband leaned slightly to get a better look. "That doesn't look normal," he muttered. Within seconds, whispers started spreading through the line. "Is that a gang tattoo? Maybe he's dangerous. Why would someone tattoo their face like that?" Phones slowly came out. A few passengers quietly started recording. The man, however, remained calm. He looked at the officer who had spoken. "Is there a problem?" he asked politely. The officer's eyes stayed fixed on the tattoo. "We need you to step aside and come with us," the officer said firmly. Another officer moved closer, clearly prepared in case the situation became dangerous. But the man didn't resist. He calmly picked up his small bag and stepped out of the security line. Travelers moved aside as the officers escorted him away. Some people stared with wide eyes. Others shook their heads, already assuming the worst. One teenage boy whispered excitedly while filming with his phone, "This is crazy. They're arresting him." A mother quickly pulled her child closer. "Don't stare," she whispered nervously. The officers guided the man toward a private security hallway beside the checkpoint. The atmosphere around them felt tense. Even the airport staff nearby watched quietly as they passed. Inside the hallway, the noise of the terminal faded. The bright lights buzzed softly above them. The officer leading the group stopped and turned to face the man. "Before we go any further, I need you to tell us something," he said. The man nodded calmly. "Yes." The officer pointed toward the tattoo. "What does that mean?" For a moment, the man didn't answer. His expression didn't change, but his eyes seemed to carefully study the officers standing in front of him. Another officer crossed his arms. "We had reports about suspicious markings," he said, "and your tattoo matches certain patterns we've seen before." The man raised an eyebrow slightly. "Patterns?" he repeated. "Yes," the officer said. "Symbols that sometimes appear in organized groups." In other words, they suspected it might be connected to a gang or something worse. The man slowly exhaled. "I understand why it might look unusual," he said, "but I promise you it's not what you think." The officers exchanged quick glances. "Then explain it." One of them said. The man looked down at his hands for a brief moment. Then he looked back at them. "I can explain some of it," he said. "But before we go any further, you might want to contact someone from federal security." The officers frowned. "Why?" the first officer asked. The man spoke calmly. "Because the situation may turn into a misunderstanding." The officer narrowed his eyes. "A misunderstanding about a tattoo?" The man nodded slightly. "Yes." The officers were clearly unconvinced. From their perspective, the situation looked suspicious. A traveler with a strange coded tattoo across his neck, asking for federal contact before answering questions. That only raised more concerns. The second officer spoke again. "Look, sir, if you're hiding something, now is the time to be honest." The man didn't seem nervous. In fact, he looked strangely patient. "I'm not hiding anything," he replied. "Then tell us what the tattoo means," the officer demanded. The man paused again. His eyes briefly moved toward the security camera in the corner of the hallway. Then he said something unexpected. "You're focusing on the wrong part of the tattoo." The officers looked confused. "What do you mean?" one asked. "The symbols," the man said, "aren't the important part." Now the officers were even more suspicious. "Then what is?" the first officer asked. The man slowly turned his head slightly, giving them a clearer view of the tattoo. "Look closer," he said. The officers leaned in. They could see the strange lines and shapes more clearly now. But what stood out the most were the numbers. Long sets of numbers placed carefully between the symbols. The officer pulled out his phone and took a photo. "What are these numbers?" he asked. The man gave a quiet answer. "Coordinates." The officers looked at each other. "Coordinates for what?" the officer asked. The man met their eyes calmly. "That," he said quietly, "is a much longer story." The hallway fell silent. Outside the door, the busy airport continued moving as if nothing unusual had happened. Flights were boarding. Passengers were rushing to their gates. But inside that quiet hallway, the officers had no idea that the mysterious tattoo they thought was dangerous was about to reveal a story far more surprising than any of them expected. The small airport security room felt unusually quiet. A single fluorescent light hummed softly above the metal table, where the tattooed man sat calmly in his chair. The room itself was simple. Gray walls, a security camera in the corner, and a table where officers usually questioned suspicious passengers. But today, the atmosphere inside that room felt different. 3 airport police officers stood around the table, studying the man carefully. The man didn't look nervous. He wasn't sweating, shaking, or trying to explain himself quickly like most people who ended up in this room. Instead, he sat with his hands resting calmly on the table, almost as if he had experienced this kind of situation before. One officer pulled out his phone and zoomed in on the photo he had taken of the tattoo in the hallway. "Look at this," he said, showing the screen to the other officers. The strange tattoo filled the display. Dark lines stretched across the man's neck, like a carefully designed map. Between the lines were symbols. Some looked like arrows, others like small geometric shapes. But the most noticeable part was the numbers. long rows of numbers placed at certain points in the design. "Those aren't random," one officer said quietly. "No," another replied. "They're too organized." The first officer turned the phone toward the man sitting across the table. "Let's try this again," he said. "What exactly does this tattoo represent?" The man glanced at the phone screen briefly, then looked back at the officer. "I already told you," he said calmly. "They're coordinates." One officer leaned forward, clearly skeptical. "Coordinates to where?" The man shrugged slightly. "Different places." The officer sighed. "That's not a real answer." The man remained calm. "I'm giving you the honest answer." The officers exchanged frustrated looks. From their perspective, the situation was becoming stranger by the minute. A mysterious tattoo made of coordinates and coded symbols, and a traveler who didn't seem worried about being detained. It simply didn't make sense. The second officer walked around the table and stopped directly beside the man. "Look," he said in a firm tone, "if you cooperate, this will go much faster." "I am cooperating," the man replied. "Then explain the symbols," the officer said, pointing toward the tattoo. The man hesitated for the first time. For a moment, his calm expression changed slightly. "I can't explain everything," he admitted. The officers immediately reacted. "Why not?" one demanded. The man sighed quietly. "Because some of it isn't meant to be public information." Now the officers looked even more suspicious. "So you admit it's secret?" the officer asked. "In a way," the man answered carefully. The first officer folded his arms. "Secret coordinates on your neck, hidden symbols, and you won't explain them." He shook his head. "You understand why that looks suspicious, right?" The man nodded. "Yes, I do." "Then help us understand." The man looked down at the table for a few seconds, as if thinking about how much he should say. Finally, he spoke again. "The coordinates represent places," he said slowly. "Important places." "Important how?" one officer asked. The man looked up. Their places where something happened. The officers waited for him to continue, but he stopped there. "That's it?" the officer asked. "For now," the man said. The room became quiet again. One officer tapped the table impatiently. "All right," he said. "If you won't explain it properly, we'll figure out ourselves." He turned toward his partner. "Call the intelligence desk." The second officer nodded and stepped outside the room with his phone. Inside the room, the first officer continued studying the tattoo photo. He zoomed in on one set of numbers. 34.0522, he read quietly. 118.2437. He frowned. "That looks like latitude and longitude." The tattooed man didn't react. The officer looked at him again. "Those are GPS coordinates, aren't they?" The man gave a small nod. "Yes." The officer tapped the phone screen again. "There are dozens of them." "Yes," the man confirmed. The officer leaned closer. "Why would someone tattoo dozens of coordinates on their neck?" The man gave a faint smile. "That's the part you'll understand soon." Just then, the door opened. The officer who had stepped outside returned, holding his phone. "They're analyzing the image now," he said. "Good," the first officer replied. Minutes passed slowly. The officers waited while the security analyst examined the tattoo image on the other end of the phone. The tattooed man remained calm the entire time. No nervous movements. No signs of fear. Just quiet patience. Finally, the officer's phone rang. Everyone in the room turned toward him. He answered immediately. "This is Officer Daniels," he said. "Yes, we sent the image." He listened carefully. At first, his face showed normal curiosity. Then something changed. His eyebrows slowly lifted. "What?" he asked into the phone. The other officers stared at him. "What did they find?" one whispered. The officer held up his hand, asking him to stay quiet while he continued listening. "You're sure?" he asked into the phone. There was a pause. Then he asked another question. "Did you check all of them?" Another pause. Suddenly his expression shifted completely. Shock, confusion, and disbelief. "You're telling me every coordinate matches?" he asked quietly. The officers in the room exchanged confused looks. "What matches?" one asked impatiently. The officer didn't answer yet. He finished the call first. "Understood," he said. "Send us the report." He slowly lowered the phone. The room went silent. The two other officers looked at him. "Well," one asked. The officer glanced at the tattooed man, sitting calmly in the chair. Then he said something none of them expected. "You didn't lie," he said. The man tilted his head slightly. "I rarely do." The officer looked stunned. "What's going on?" the second officer demanded. The first officer finally spoke. "The analyst just checked the coordinates." "And?" the officer asked. The first officer swallowed. "They're real locations." The second officer frowned. "Of course they are." "No," the first officer said quietly. "You don't understand." He slowly looked at the tattooed man again. Then he said the words that changed everything. "Every single coordinate is connected to a major disaster site." The room fell silent. The officers turned slowly toward the man. Suddenly, the strange tattoo didn't look like a code anymore. It looked like something much bigger. And they were about to discover a truth that would completely change how they saw the man sitting in front of them. The room went completely silent. For several seconds, no one spoke. The three officers looked at each other, trying to understand what they had just heard. "Disaster sites?" one officer finally asked. The officer holding the phone nodded slowly. "That's what the analyst said." He placed the phone on the table and looked again at the photo of the tattoo. The coordinates matched locations of major disaster rescue operations over the past several years. The other officers leaned closer to the screen. "Which disasters?" one of them asked. The officer scrolled through the message that had just been sent to his phone. His eyes moved slowly across the list. Then he started reading. "Earthquake in Turkey 5 years ago." He swiped again. "Major flood rescue in Indonesia." Another swipe. "Collapsed building rescue in Mexico City." The officer stopped reading and looked up. "These are all real events." The room felt heavier now. The officers slowly turned their attention back to the tattooed man, sitting calmly across from them. For the first time since he entered the room, they weren't looking at him like a suspect. They were looking at him with curiosity. One officer pointed at the tattoo. "So those coordinates, they mark these places?" The man nodded. "Yes." Another officer frowned slightly. "But why tattoo them on your neck?" The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked down at the table, his fingers lightly touching the metal surface, as if he were remembering something far away. After a moment, he spoke. "Because every one of those locations changed my life." The officers listened carefully now. The man continued. "I work with an international disaster search and rescue team." One officer's eyes widened slightly. "You mean emergency response?" The man nodded. "Yes. When major disasters happen, earthquakes, floods, building collapses, our team is sent to help find survivors." The officers exchanged surprised looks. "You're a rescue worker?" one asked. The man nodded again. "For the last 10 years. The officer holding the phone looked back at the list of coordinates. "That earthquake in Turkey, you were there?" "Yes." "And the flood rescue in Indonesia?" "Yes." "What about the Mexico City building collapse?" The man's expression became serious. "I spent 4 days in the rubble during that mission." The officers were beginning to understand. Each coordinate wasn't random. Each one marked a moment when the man had risked his life to help others. The first officer leaned forward. "How many missions are marked in the tattoo?" The man looked toward the photo. 23. The officers were stunned. 23 disasters? One asked. The man nodded. "Yes." Another officer spoke quietly. "And every coordinate represents a mission you survived?" The man hesitated slightly before answering. "Yes." The officer asked another question. "What about the symbols between the coordinates?" The man turned his head slightly, allowing them to see the tattoo more clearly. "The symbols represent different rescue teams," he explained. "Medical teams, engineering units, and search dogs." The officers looked at the photo again. What had looked like strange markings before now started to make sense. One symbol represented a rescue unit. Another symbol represented medical aid. The lines connected different missions together. It wasn't just a tattoo. It was a story, a map of disasters and rescues. The second officer spoke again. But why put something like this on your neck, where everyone can see it? The man took a slow breath before answering. Because I never want to forget. The officers waited for him to continue. The man's voice grew slightly quieter. 5 years ago, during a major earthquake mission, we were searching through a collapsed apartment building. His eyes focused on a point on the table, as if the memory was playing again in his mind. The building had fallen completely. Concrete, steel, everything crushed together. The officers listened closely. We worked for 2 days without sleep, he continued, digging through the rubble, listening for any sign of life. He paused for a moment. On the 3rd day, we heard a voice. The officers leaned closer. A little girl, the man said softly. She was trapped under 2 floors of concrete. The room remained completely silent. It took us 8 hours to reach her, he continued. 8 hours of cutting metal, lifting debris, and digging through dust. The man's eyes reflected the memory. When we finally pulled her out, she was still holding her little toy bear. One officer swallowed quietly. She survived, he asked. The man nodded. Yes. He paused before adding something else. But 2 members of my team didn't. The officers looked down. They died during the rescue, the man said calmly. For them and for every life we saved. I got the tattoo. He looked up again. Each coordinate reminds me why the work matters. The officers stared at the tattoo photo again. Before this moment, they had assumed the design meant danger. Now they realized it represented courage. One officer whispered quietly, "How many lives were saved in those missions?" The man shrugged slightly. I stopped counting after 200. The officers were speechless. 200 lives, saved by someone they had just treated like a suspect. The first officer leaned back in his chair, shaking his head slightly. So the tattoo is basically your rescue history. Yes, the man confirmed. The officer looked at the coordinates again. But why put it somewhere so visible? The man gave a small smile. Because every time someone asks about it, I get to remember the people we helped. The officers slowly nodded. For the first time since the questioning began, the atmosphere in the room had completely changed. Suspicion had turned into respect. The second officer finally spoke. "Sir, I think we owe you an apology." The man shook his head gently. "You were just doing your job." But what the officers didn't know yet was that the story of the tattoo and the man sitting in front of them was about to become even more surprising. The atmosphere inside the small security room had completely changed. Just a few minutes earlier, the officers had been questioning the tattooed man like a possible criminal. Now, they looked at him with a mixture of surprise, respect, and embarrassment. The silence in the room lasted for several seconds. Finally, one of the officers cleared his throat. "Sir, we truly didn't know," he said carefully. The man sitting across the table gave a small, calm smile. "It's all right," he replied. "You were doing your job." The officer nodded slowly, but still seemed uncomfortable. "I guess we judged too quickly," he admitted. The tattooed man shrugged slightly. "That happens more often than you'd think." The officers exchanged curious looks. "People assume things because of the tattoo?" One officer asked. The man chuckled quietly. "All the time." He leaned back slightly in his chair. "Some people think it's a gang symbol. Others think it's some kind of criminal code." He tapped lightly on the table. "In reality, it's just a reminder." The officers looked again at the photo of the tattoo on the phone screen. It was strange how different it looked now. A few minutes ago, the symbols had seemed mysterious and threatening. Now they looked meaningful, almost honorable. Just then, the officer's phone rang again. Everyone in the room looked toward the device. The officer quickly answered. "Yes." He listened quietly while the person on the other end spoke. The other officers watched his face closely. At first, he simply nodded. Then his expression slowly changed. His eyebrows lifted in surprise. "You're serious?" he asked into the phone. The man sitting across the table remained calm, as if he already knew what the call was about. The officer continued listening. "Yes, we have him here now." Another pause. "Understood." He ended the call slowly and placed the phone on the table. The other officers immediately leaned closer. "What did they say?" one asked. The officer looked toward the tattooed man again. Then he let out a quiet breath. They just confirmed his identity. The other officers waited, and one asked. The officer shook his head slightly, still amazed. He's not just a rescue worker. The officers looked confused. What do you mean? The officer glanced at the message that had just arrived on his phone. They ran his name through international emergency response records. He looked back up, and apparently he's one of the most decorated disaster responders in the world. The room went silent again. The two officers stared at the man in disbelief. "You're serious?" one of them asked. The officer nodded. "Yes." He scrolled through the message. It says he's been part of dozens of high-risk rescue missions across multiple countries. Another officer leaned closer. "What kind of missions?" The officer read from the report. Major earthquakes, collapsed cities, flood evacuations, and international disaster response operations. He looked back at the man sitting calmly in front of them. Several governments have awarded him medals for bravery. The officers stared at him with wide eyes. "You never mentioned any of that," one of them said. The man gave a small smile. "I wasn't asked." The officer shook his head in disbelief. Still, most people would lead with that. The man's expression remained humble. "I didn't join rescue missions for recognition," he said quietly. "I joined because people needed help." The room fell silent again. For the officers, the situation felt almost unreal. They had stopped a traveler because of a strange tattoo, and now they were sitting across from someone who had helped save hundreds of lives around the world. One officer finally stood up. "Sir, I think it's time we get you back to your flight." The man nodded. "That would be great." The officers opened the door and escorted him back into the busy airport terminal. The moment they stepped outside the security hallway, the noise of the airport returned. Announcements echoed overhead. Passengers rushed through the terminal. Travelers lined up at the boarding gates. But something else was happening, too. A few people who had witnessed the earlier arrest were still standing nearby. Some of them still had their phones in their hands. They watched with curiosity as the officers walked beside the tattooed man again. But this time, the situation looked very different. Instead of surrounding him like a suspect, the officers were walking beside him respectfully. One officer even extended his hand. "Thank you for what you do," he said sincerely. The man shook his hand politely. "You're welcome," another officer added. "And again, we're sorry for the misunderstanding." The man smiled. "No problem." As they approached the departure gates, the officers stopped walking. "This is your gate," one officer said. The man picked up his travel bag and adjusted the strap on his shoulder. "Well," he said, "I guess this is where we say goodbye." The officers nodded. One of them looked again at the tattoo on the man's neck. Just hours earlier, that tattoo had seemed suspicious. Now it looked like something completely different. A reminder of courage. A symbol of sacrifice. A map of lives saved. The officer spoke again before the man left. "Can I ask you one last question?" The man stopped. "Of course." The officer pointed gently toward the tattoo. "Are you planning to add more coordinates?" The man smiled slightly. "If I have to." Then he turned and walked toward the boarding line. Within moments, he disappeared into the crowd of travelers. The officers stood there quietly for a moment. Finally, one of them pulled out his phone and looked again at the photo of the tattoo. "It's strange," he said. "What?" another officer asked. The officer shook his head slightly. Something that looked so dangerous at first. He looked toward the gate where the man had just disappeared. Turned out to be the story of a hero, and sometimes the things people judge the fastest are the things they understand the least.